We're talking about the biggest single civilian massacre in Western Europe outside of the camps. Terrible things were happening in Italy. Lots and lots of partisan bands sort of emerging, but for me, there is only one, and that's the Stella Rossa. And they're operating in the mountains 15 miles south of Bologna. I think it's all very Robin Hood, if I'm honest. There were three crystal clear choices. Either go with the fascists, the Germans, or choose to fight with the partisans. As a young man, those were your three choices. Kesselring issues his final warning. You need to turn in all these guys, and if you don't, we're going to treat you all as partisans. And his brief is absolutely clear. Clear the mountains entirely, kill the lot. The idea is to cast a wide net and just basically go up like that and just destroy everything. As machine guns open up, the bodies start falling on top of her and blood is spreading all over her body. He sees the massacre, that mountain community which he's known all his life, being destroyed. This is a very personal story to me.
Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, the Second World War podcast of choice, of course. So, James, what are we talking about today?
Well, we are talking about partisan activities in northern Italy, and we're talking about the biggest single civilian massacre in Western Europe outside of the camps. It wasn't Orador, it wasn't Lodici, it was Montesoli at the end of September 1944, and it's a subject which I have been living with for the past 25 years, and a subject in which I've gone into in enormous detail. I've walked that ground many, many times. It's one that is very, very close to my heart. I met a number of the people that were involved, and it's just the most astonishing story. Terrible things were happening in Italy as the Allied forces were kind of heading their way north. And it's very easy to just assume it was just the battle lines on the front line, but this terrific battle was going on behind. There were lots and lots of partisan bands sort of emerging, but for me, there is only one, and that's the Stella Rossa. These guys were total dudes. And Major Mario was Mario Musolesi, whose nom de guerre, who's actually his nickname from childhood, was Lupo, which means wolf. And he's an incredibly alluring and charismatic character. And more about him later on as we go through. But it's a stunning part of the world. I mean, really, it's just amazing.
What happens in Italy, though, is essentially once the fascist government has collapsed and then a new puppet fascist government is installed at Salo under Mussolini, you essentially have a vacuum, don't you? An anarchic vacuum. Yes. that develops. With the Germans under huge pressure from the Allies, of course, this feeling that the war is going to tip into victory. No one quite knows when it's going to end. There are scores to settle, which is very much implied in that communique, that there are lines to be drawn for the future Italy to come, and that essentially a kind of state of civil war exists in the enemy rear, as it were, in Italy to the north of the German lines, right?
Absolutely. We're going to look at a bit of the background of this. We'll look at the bit of the background of the politics of what's going on in northern Italy, the kind of sort of split between what control the Italians have, what control the Germans have, which is frankly is 99% of it, and the rise of the partisan bands in general. But we're going to specifically look at this band, the Stella Rossa, as a kind of an example. They are exceptional for a number of reasons, which will become clear. And they're operating in the mountains about 15 miles south of Bologna, incredibly beautiful part of the Apennines. And these are communities that have been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries, a bit like San Pietro south of Cassino, which suddenly over a course of a couple of days is just wiped clean forever. And it's very, very traumatic. I thought it'd be interesting to start with Carlo Venturi. So Carlo was only 18 in the spring of 1944, and he lived in the tiny little mountain village of Fondazza, southwest of Bologna. And in May 1944, he received his call-up papers as one of the class of 1925, eligible for service. But anyway, his family are contadini, and contadini are sharecroppers. And basically what they would do is they would grow their crops for the padrone, the overseer, who's usually a sort of absentee landlord. The absentee landlord would have agents. Agents would come around and go, hand over half your profits. And that's how it worked. And it's incredibly feudal, but that is how the vast majority of farming was played out in Italy at that time. They weren't interested in politics at all. They were neither pro-fascist nor anti-fascist. They just couldn't care. And Carlo told me, he said, my father just didn't want to get involved. He just wanted to kind of keep his head down. And he doesn't have a tessera, which is the fascist card, which everyone had to have, because He's a contadino, so he doesn't need one. You need one if you're in public office of any kind, but you don't if you're a farmer. Carlo, on the other hand, was, he's 18, he's young, he's a bright kid. He really resents the fact that there's still fighting, resents deeply that the Germans are now occupying Italy. He's a very proud young Italian. And with a couple of friends at one point, they start talking. They go, let's do something. So they attack an abandoned army barracks. The armistice was signed on the 8th of September, 1943. And then the Germans just swept in and cleared out all the Italian armed forces and all the barracks and so on. We're talking about October 1943. So they haven't all been cleared out. There's quite a lot of, there's a hiatus, there's a bit of confusion. So they go in there and they break in and they kind of nick some rifles and stuff. And they have a sort of vague notion of fighting back, but they don't really know what to do with any of it. So they basically just hide them in Carlo's attic because he lives in the countryside. So it's sort of, it's safer. But he's soon in trouble. And one day he's on his way to Bologna, and the tram he's on is stopped, and GNR men, these are the fascist militia, come on, and he's hauled off and accused of having a hand grenade in his pocket.
This is kind of absurd.
It's a bread roll. It isn't a hand grenade. So he's taken to jail, and then he's beaten up, because these guys are just throwing their weight around. That's what's going on. And he said, from that time on, I told myself I had to make them pay. Later, he's then arrested again, and he's taken to the GNR barracks, and he's accused of harboring arms. And it turns out he's been turned in by the fascist who lives on the house on the hill above him, above his family. So Carlo manages to convince them he's innocent. So they get rid of the arms before they get raided. But at the same time, it's time for him to report to duty because he's been drafted. And at this point, he has a stark choice, sign on the dotted line or take to the hills. So on the 16th of May, without telling his parents, without telling any of his family, because it wouldn't be safe to do so, he just leaves. He just walks out of the house one day. They have no idea what's happened to him, don't know where he is. And he heads to Sasso Marconi, which is like a small little town. And he spots 4 young men sitting by the side of the road. And they just don't look like fascists. But he's not sure. He doesn't know what to say, because which way do you go? It's kind of, they're wearing civvies and stuff. They go, where are you going? He goes, I was looking for you. And they go, well, what do you mean? And what are you doing here? So he has to have this leap of faith where he just goes, I'm looking to join the partisans. But if he got that wrong, but he hasn't, he's got it right. So it's okay. They are partisans, and they take him to a house above the Seta Valley. And they go, right, you're staying with us tonight. And the next day they pick up someone else. And then they head up into the mountains, and this is the mountains of the Monte Soli Massif. And they take him to a place called Cabrageda. They're up there the following morning, and the sun is rising and towering above him. He can see, the heights of Monte Salvare and Monte Soli, which gives the name to the chain of mountains at that point. You can see little settlements up in the mountains and little villages. So there's quite a sort of mountain settlement up there. Now he's among partisans, and he sees men carrying rifles and Sten guns and stuff, and they're all kind of looking at him quite suspiciously. I mean, just imagine being him. You're 18, you've left home, you haven't told your parents. Suddenly you're in it. You're sinking or swimming, aren't you? Because even if you do become a partisan and they accept you, you've now signed up to a life from which there is no escape until liberation comes.
It's not like joining the Italian army and throwing your rifle in the river and going home, is it?
Quite different. Anyway, so the second man who's joined the day after him is then ordered to dig a pit. And Carlo suddenly thinks, oh my God, I can see what's going to happen. And so does the new guy. So he runs for it. And as he runs for it, someone opens fire with a Sten gun, cuts him down. They chuck him in the pit and bury him. And Carlo's just sort of like, oh my God. And they go, that guy was a spy. He was a fascist spy. And then they turn to him, and he's just thinking, he's absolutely cacking himself. And he says, but I'm not like that. I've stolen weapons. I've done this. I've done that. And they go, okay, well, we're going to check you out. But, we can't afford we can't afford to have spies here. So for 3 days, he's kept up in the mountains under guard. Then suddenly some guys come in and they go, right, we're going to take you to see our leader. And this is Mario Musolese, known as Lupo. He's in his late 20s. He's like 28, 29 at this point. Dark-haired, thin-faced, very charismatic, very sort of unhairy. He's not a hirsute man. And Lupo shakes his hand and says, yeah, no, we've checked you out. You're kosher. It's good. They then take him to see Gianni Rossi, who's a smaller guy, who's the second in command. You just wouldn't cross Gianni Rossi at all. Carlo's given a Sten gun, 5 magazines, assigned to a company led by Golfieri. They all have nom de guerres. All means of his ID are taken off him, everything. He's sworn not to make contact with his family on pain of death. A harsh necessity. And they're like, you're now one of us.
So he's a member of the Stella Rossa. That's Red Star, right? Are these guys communists?
They are absolutely not. And this is one of the great ironies of it, is they are one of the very, very few partisans, if not the only partisan band, which is apolitical and maintains its apolitical status right to the very end. Lupo is having none of it. He wants people of all persuasions. He says, this is not a time for politics. This is a time for beating the Nazi fascists. Then we can sort out politics afterwards. But anyway, Carlo said to me, he said, there were three crystal clear choices. Either go with the fascists, the Germans, or choose to fight with the partisans. As a young man, those were your three choices. And failure to report to duty after the call-up was punishable by death. And word of these executions spread, of course, pretty rapidly. So many do exactly what Carlo's done and flee to the hills and the mountains, of which there are a plentiful amount in Italy. He is now a fully fledged member of the Stella Rossa as of the end of May. But I think it's worth just sort of explaining to people about the German occupation, really.
That's what it is. There is an occupation. It's that from being allies, being close, ideological, but pals and all that, it's quite the opposite now. And we also know what the Germans tend to think of their allies, that they're just to be exploited. So now the Italians are not their allies anymore and are they occupied, essentially their enemy. So the ambassador's Dr. Rudolf Rahn, he says everything in occupied Italy must be exploited by us for our war effort. So they take the Italian gold reserves. The North's factories are turned over to Speer. As the Allies advance, they shut down factories or blow plant up, which is, after all, what Hitler's proposing for Germany at the end of the war. The Italians are also then expected to pay for all German-related war costs. So having taken the Italian gold and denuded Italy of its means production, they've also got to then pay for everything.
That's Sheriff of Nottingham stuff, isn't it? I mean, don't you think?
Yeah. And by May of 1944, the Republic is handing over 10 billion lira a month, which is £3 million today. But basically, they have no money and they're being ransacked. They're having their pockets turned out. If you're an Italian who thought that, the previous September, we've surrendered, we're out of the war, it's over, this must be very dismaying. There isn't an end to the war. There's German troops everywhere. The country's being stripped bare. And absolutely every infringement is punishable by death because the Germans are not mucking about.
It's all properly medieval stuff.
There's also this 10-for-1 policy that Kesselring has set up after the attack on the Vera Cella in Rome on the 23rd of March 1944, where basically the Germans will round up civilians, and if they can't find partisans, then what they'll do is they'll kill 10 for every German killed. Hitler wanted 50 for one, but Kesselring is the voice of calm moderation about this and says, that's just going too far.
So you've got all the ex-armed forces. They've been sent to Germany. So that's about 750,000 Italians. They're operating under forced labour under Fritz Sauckel. So by May 1944, there's 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany. It's quite a number, isn't it? And then Italian men are also recruited to the organisation TOT. So people who are not of kind of service age. So this would be over 40s, late 30s onwards, 50-year-olds. They're all taken in and recruited into the organisation TOD, which is the kind of, the labour force. So these are the people that are building the Gothic line and doing manual labour. But the key thing is that Mussolini has persuaded Hitler to allow him to recruit some troops. None of the Germans wanted this to happen. But no. Hitler always maintained this sort of weird affection for Mussolini, and so gives in. And he's not allowed an army, but he's allowed to raise 4 new divisions. Since, all these ex-forces were now in Germany, these had to be recruited from the younger generations of Italians. So from the classes of 1923, 1924, and 1925. Plus 12,000 former officers and NCOs are released from Germany to go back and help set this up. And Carlo Venturi is one of those. That is why he's being recruited. And the initial conscription raises 50,000 men very quickly by May 1944. But then the numbers drop really, really dramatically. Why? Because it's summer. Why? Because the Allies are winning. They've taken Rome. And so everyone's thinking, I don't want to be on the losing side. And I don't want it to be that in the first place. And I don't really mind being in the mountains in summer. Doesn't sound so great in winter, but no one's interested anymore. I mean, there are still people who want to be fascists and stuff, but by and large, the wind is sort of starting to change. What is really interesting, though, is that they're also recruiting for the SS police battalions under Karl Wolff, of course, and they have 200,000 Italians join those. So 4 times as many.
Is the pay good?
Well, it's better than being a partisan. You get pay. If you're a partisan, you are outlaw. You are outside the law. You are cast out of society. So you have nothing. Whereas if you're in the GNR or in the SS police battalion, you've got barracks, you've got 3 square meals a day, you've got, blah, blah, blah. You've got a pay packet. And ditto with the GNR. Yeah. So the SS tends to attract people who are just sort of thinking, well, I just need to look after number one. The GNR are people who are fascist, are right wing and kind of sort of think, no, I think the fascist way is a good way. So these are basically replacements of the old sort of squadristi. But, if you don't fancy any of this, then the only alternative is to become an outlaw. You've got to weigh up a whole host of different factors here. But the odds are slightly more in your favor in summer than they are in winter with the Allies on the march.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the idea, though, that there's something for more motivated people than the SS. Because after all, there's a spike in recruitment in the milice, isn't there, after D-Day? That in France, you get a similar thing where people move to the fascist end of the political spectrum one way or another. And, there are lots of reasons young men join organisations when they're pushed to.
The GNR is also more localised. You'd have the Carabinieri, which is a sort of military wing of the police, but it's basically the police. Then you have the GNR, which is the militia. But you would have those dotted in all the towns. There would be a GNR barracks in every town, as there would be a Carabinieri. The SS battalion, you wouldn't. So if you were joining the SS, you might be sent to the Alps. You might be sent all over. You could be anywhere. And so you're taken away from your homestead. Whereas if you stayed in the GNR, you would still probably be, within 10 miles of your birthplace.
Or, your dad's a member or your brother's a member and you say you've got to toe the line. There's all these push and pull things. And as Allied victory gets closer, you're really thinking, wow, which one do I choose?
The father might have a job that's dependent on his tessera, his fascist card, which they still have at this time. And so he's thinking, well, I don't, if you run off the hills, then we're not going to have anything. These are really not straightforward choices at all. At a time where the news and information about actually what is happening is incredibly sparse. And you've just got to, at the end of the day, it's a punt. But it's worth just mentioning about the RSI, which is the Repubblica Sociale di Italiano. And this is the new fascist government, a puppet government based in Salo, which is a tiny town on Lake Garda, not Rome. Mussolini is the figurehead, but he is a much denuded figure since his overthrow the previous July. He sprung from prison by Otto Scorzeni and his thugs in the Gran Sasso in a few days after the invasion. He's allowed to reform his fascist militia under Renato Ricci, who was the former head of the Squadristi, which are the black shirt hit squads, the infamous hit squads of militia of the sort of 1930s and 20s. And it's now renamed the Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana, which is the GNR. And this is run alongside the Carabinieri. And the fascist party is up again and up and running, but now is not led by Mussolini. It's led by Alessandro Pavellini, who is an intellectual and former magazine editor from Florence. Very good-looking, dashing chap. And he is the head of the Partito Repubblicano Fascista, the PRF. But the real control day to day is under Karl Wolff, who is the Obergruppenführer and highest police officer in Italy. And basically he's running the show. So the idea is that Kesselring is the military commander. Wolff deals with everything else. So GNR, Republican, the policing, the Carabinieri, the day-to-day operations of the country is all run by Wolff, not by Mussolini. So, is it any surprise they're running to the mountains?
It's interesting, isn't it, Jim? Because the French resistance is synonymous with the Second World War, right? Our ideas of it, our popular conception of it, how it sits in people's imagination. The Italian partisans, less so. You would call the Italians partisans, wouldn't you? Where you talk about the French resistance. In people's imaginings, I think there's a kind of difference in the vocabulary. The further east you go, the more they're partisans than they are resistors. You know what I mean?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, the Italian campaign is just not as well known as the war in Northwest Europe and the war in France and Normandy and so on. So British female SOE types aren't sent to Italy as well, which helps in the narrative, I think.
Yeah.
But it's basically because the Italian campaign is less well known, which is why no one's heard of the Massacre of Montezuoli, for example. Yeah. It's incredible, really, because they play a huge part. The ANPI, which is the Association Nazionale Partisans d'Italia, is a very big deal, or certainly was a very, very big deal in Italy. Every town would have its ANPI headquarters office, and you'd go there and, there they'd all be and stuff. And these guys were mates for life, but just less so outside of Italy, I suppose.
There are partisans popping up all over Italy. I think what's interesting is here's an actual organised group. What are their origins, Jim?
I should just tell you about the amazing meeting I had with Gianni Rossi. So I went. So this all came about because in 2004, President Rau of Germany, as he then was, the president of Germany, had gone over to Marzabotto, which was the town nearest to Montefiore, and had publicly apologized for what had happened. And there was a story there, and they'd interviewed some people who'd witnessed the massacre. And I had no idea about this huge partisan activity and fascists and the GNR and all the rest of it, and the terrible choices one had to make, and how it ripped apart kind of a lot of Italian society in the process. Was this civil war. Now, anyway, so Gianni, he told me all about his life and his growing up and all the rest of it. He came from a family of anti-fascists. Right. I mean, lots of people were just comme ça, but he wasn't. Anyway, Gianni's born in February 1923. He's an apprentice mechanic in Bologna, and then he's drafted in the war and joins the Navy. But in the summer of 1943, he's ill. So he's convalescing back at home when the armistice comes. So which is why he's not put in the bag or picked up by the Germans. And during this time, he meets up with Mario Mussolesi. Mario Mussolesi was always known as Lupo, even as a boy. And he's this sort of tall, stringy guy. But he's also there because he's been in North Africa. He was drafted into the army, served in North Africa, was captured by the British, managed to escape, got picked up, then got wounded in the Tunisia campaign and was invalided back home, which is why he's, again, also avoided being put in the bag. But he's very smart, very charismatic. He's one of these people that sort of draws people to him. Both of them are kind of sort of lumbering around, wondering when they're going to get drafted and picked up. And there's two key events that push them towards resistance. And the first one is suddenly there's a whole load of anti-fascist posters get put up in Vardo. And Lupo is blamed for these because he's been so vehemently against being recruited. I think, well, it must be him. He's the only guy who'd have the nerve to do this. He's been denounced by someone. So he finds that the guy's denounced him, beats him to a pulp, and then is arrested. But he's released, after a couple of days.
Yeah.
But he's marked.
Right.
And then the second thing is that Lupo moves back to the family home at Cav Veneziani, and it's right on the River Seta, but it's on the side of the railway line, which is on the western side of the River Seta. They see this train come along and are watching when they see 5 POWs, Allied POWs, jump from the train.
Gosh.
Lupo and Gianni spontaneously decide they're going to help them. They hide them in barns in the mountains. At this point, Lupo and Gianni decide to go underground permanently. They kick off by raiding a local GNR barracks. And as Gianni said, he said, we didn't have much of a plan. We borrowed a lorry, raided one of the barracks, took a stash of rifles and ammunition. They're kind of making up as they're going along. But they decide that they need to have some organization. You can just imagine the kind of excitement, the kind of nerves, the apprehension, but also the kind of the thrill of going, right, we're rebels, we're partisans. And if we're partisans, we need to have a charter. And they've now got like a dozen people. They consecrate the Stella Rossa in the crypt of the church at Vardo, overseen by the local priest, who's Don Iolo Catani. And Lupo is elected, voted in as the leader of this new band, and Gianni as the second in command. And they call themselves the Stella Rossa. And right from the word go, they go, we're not going to be political.
Well, it's odd, isn't it? But also, this is the autumn of 43. The people in the summer are thinking, well, the mountains aren't that bad. It'll be okay. They're not thinking like this. These are people who are properly mobilized, properly radicalized against the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very clear that Lupo's the right man for the job because he's got this terrific charisma. We've all met these people. They're the guy in the village, they're the youngster in the village who everyone just sort of is drawn to because they're cleverer, they're more self-confident, more self-assured. He's seen some action. He's got fire in his belly. Yeah. It's the truth of it.
Yeah.
So you can see what happens. But, by end of November, there's about 20 of them. And their first big action is blowing up a freight convoy, which is halted on the railway line. So this is Germans, but they're all manned by the Italians. Gianni said, he opened fire of emotion. He said it was just something I had to do. And I remember saying to him, didn't you feel a bit funny about opening fire on your fellow Italians? And do you know what he said? I remember this absolutely crystal clear. He just went, they had their dance, we had ours.
Wow. You have your dance, I have mine. I mean, that's very, very, very tough, isn't it?
They're not doing very much over the winter, that first winter of 1943 and into the beginning of 1944. You know, the front is stagnant, nothing's much happening. You know, they're basically what they're trying to do. They're basically hiding rather than being active. You know, they've taken to the mountains. Everyone knows them, but you know, this is so localized, this community. All these little settlements, everyone knows who Lupo is. So hiding in the mountains is like, you know, they're not going to be stitched up by those guys. Or are they? Because they are stitched up, because there are threats to them. At the end of January 1944, Olindo Samaki, who is Cagnoni, is one of the originals. And he's one of the guys who's been in the crypt and the Church of Vardo at the consecration of the Stella Rossa. And he betrays Lupo. No one knows quite why he's done, but it's probably pressure from family. You know, they're starving. On the information from Cagnoni, the fascists then send a spy to infiltrate the Stella Rossa, and this is Amedeo Arcioni. And right from the moment that Arcioni turns up, Lupo suspects him and talks to Gianni about it. But Lupo is always weirdly, for a man of his position, actually quite squeamish about killing people. He doesn't know what to do about Arcioni, so he divers a bit. He just also can't believe that Cagnoni has betrayed him. Yeah. One night they're in this cave, and the cave they've lined with wood to make it a little bit more habitable. And Lupo's on guard, and he's got a knife, and he's taken out his knife out of its sheath, and he's stuck it in the roof where the wood is, so it's hanging down. And suddenly Arcioni jumps up, grabs a knife, and attacks Lupo and stabs him in the arm. And Lupo screams out, which wakes up Gianni. So Gianni tries to knock off Amedeo, jumps on him, rolls on him, but Arcioni's still got the knife and gets on top of him. He's bigger than Gianni. And the knife is coming down towards him like this. And he's just going like this. And the knife pierces his forehead. And when I met him, he still had the scar. So I said, so what did you do with Arcioni? And he said, I took him outside. And anyway, 6th of May, Lupo's brother Guido is arrested. And he's been working undercover at the local fascist headquarters and feeding information to the Stella Rossa. The GNR then go to the Mussolesi home in Cavaneziani and burn it to the ground. And they lock up Lupo's parents as well. And as you can imagine, he goes apeshit. Yeah. And they mount a raid on the GNR barracks, kill everyone, and spring them all out of prison.
Springing your family does rather indicate that you are a partisan, though, doesn't it? It's some of it's not particularly considered, right? It's interesting. I'm sort of trying to resist saying this, but it feels like clannish and
it is. It really is.
Some of the things people think stereotypically about Italy, and yet there they are, literally springing his mum and dad from prison. Fair enough.
Yeah, I think it's all very Robin Hood, if I'm honest. I mean, I think it's exactly what it is. You know, the mountains are Sherwood Forest, and the villages and Vardo is Nottingham or whatever. I mean, everyone knows who they are. Everyone knows there is the Stella Rossa partisan band. Occasionally, they're going to kind of head down into the valleys, but that is where they're basing. And you know, if you want to go up there and confront Lupo, good luck. Everyone's going to see you coming, and this is their manner. You know, they know every square yard of those mountains. And it's interesting because when you are up in Montesoli and Montesalvari and that mountain community, it's not a huge area, maybe 3 miles wide, sort of 6 miles in length, that kind of stretch, something like that. You know, it's really, and the core of it is, you know, a matter of a few square miles. You'd know everywhere. You know all the houses, you know every track, every trail, every bit of wood. You can see how it sort of develops. And you know, the Stella Rossa gets stronger and stronger as it's summer. And also there's the whiff of success. And, you know, as I say, there's nothing like kind of the Allied lines being on the move to kind of give everyone a massive fillip. So, but being a partisan is a summer job, basically. You know, there is a politicization going on of the partisans. There is a wider resistance, a political resistance movement going on in Italy. And obviously, before the armistice, you know, all political parties except the Fascist Party had been banned in Italy. But once the armistice has been signed, the 6 main opposition parties actually form themselves into a single anti-fascist entity in Rome. And this is the CLN, the Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale. These are 6 parties. So there is the Italian Communist Party, the PCI. There are the Christian Democrats. There are the Liberals, who are really quite right-wing. There are the Labour Democrats. And then there is the Action Party, the Partito d'Azione, which is a new party named after Giuseppe Mazzini's party. And then there's the Socialists. The PCI, the Communists, the Socialists, and the Action Party, they're all very anti-monarchist because there is still a monarchy in Italy at this point. Even throughout the whole fascist period, there was still a king. Yeah. Victoria Emmanuel III. And then the liberals, they're pro-monarchy. So politically, they're all quite diverse, but they all stick together. And the interesting thing is very cleverly, they all agree that the president of the CLN should be Ivano Bonomi, and he is the former pre-fascist prime minister. Throughout the summer of 1943, the CLN is helping to set up clandestine committees in northern Italy behind Allied lines, in the area of the Nazi occupation and the RSI, the neo-fascist party. Milan becomes the official clandestine government and supreme organ of the resistance movement, and it now becomes known as the CLNAI, l'Alta Italian, Higher Italy, Northern Italy. And at the same time, the communists and the Action Party are taking control of a large number of partisan bands. The Garibaldi brigades, they emerge, and they're broadly communist. Then the Action Party brigades are known as the Giustizia e Libertà, the Justice and Liberty brigades. But Stella Rossa want nothing to do with this. They don't want political commissars. They don't want politicization. They just want to be neutral, and Lupo absolutely sticks to this. We'll get rid of the Nazi fascists, then we can talk about politics. But right now, I don't want the brigade to be split up on kind of political grounds.
I think that is pretty smart. If everyone else is doing it, it puts you in an invidious position, is the truth. And in the next part, well, we'll get to what happens. And I think the direction of travel, in the way we're telling this, you might have figured out what's going to happen next. Join us for part 2. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland for our second part of Death in the Mountains.
In April 1944, and this is a big moment for Stella Rossa, they make contact with an OSS agent, an Italian called Lino Rocco. And Lino Rocco has been a telegraphist in the Italian Navy. And then after the armistice is in the south of the country and gets recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. The previous summer, he'd met a girl called Liliana Nicoletti in Fiume, and he escaped south, and he's later landed by submarine on the Adriatic coast. And rather than going to where he's supposed to go, he immediately goes up to Fiume to look for his girlfriend. When he gets there, he finds out that Liliana has moved back to Bologna. So he then goes all the way to Bologna, only to discover that her family has moved again to Vado, this little town just south of Bologna on the Seta Valley. Basically, he's just chasing skirts.
It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, honestly.
These guys are really seriously amateur. And I suspect what Lino Rocco said is, yeah, I'll do this. I can do telegraphy. I can do radio work. I can do Morse.
Yeah.
I'm just the guy. I hate fascists. And all he wants is to get back to his girlfriend. Liliana says, you need to contact the Stella Rossa, because obviously he's in the OSS. He's in the force of the Allies. And he goes, great. Fine, I've got my partisan band.
Yeah.
I can organise some arms drops. It all goes absolutely accordingly to plan. They come down full of battle dresses and Sten guns and ammunition and Bren guns and grenades and explosives and TNT and, everything you could possibly want. By the end of May, they've got about 250 people. By this point, they're really starting to make a serious impact, is the truth of it.
This is raids on trains, roadblocks. You've the two valleys, the Seta and the Reno. So you've actually got areas you can control. Inevitably, the Germans think, well, we're not going to put up with this. And on the 28th of May, 1944, they respond with a rastrellamento, a sweep up with using the GNR, and the Stella Rossa are ready. Because the thing is, I imagine by this stage of the war, people know which way the war's going. So some kid will run up into the hills and say to the Stella Rossa, they're putting together a posse to come and find you. You better be ready. They drive off this sweep. And Rossi says it was a good fight, really. We killed about 240 Germans, but only one of our men was wounded.
They're dug in. They're hiding in the trees and caves and all the rest of it. Yeah. See them coming, just mow them down, and they're flush with arms. The Germans and the fascists couldn't have chosen a worse time to do this.
Yeah.
This is where they're absolutely at kind of peak power, the Stella Rossa.
The GNR start deserting the following month in June, which is interesting. Again, it's this thing of it all falling apart. And Gianni then leads a raid on the barracks. They steal more weapons. They round up the rest and give them a chance to join the Stella Rossa. At rifle point, Possibly. Most do. The rest are killed, and with knives to save on ammunition. If this is Robin Hood, it's not quite the Disney version, is it? There's more Germans captured by partisans south of Monticello. They both surrender, but one shot anyway. The others are taken to the partisan camp. He's pleading for his life, showing photos of his family, and instead they pin him to the ground with knives and they leave him to die.
Yeah, that's done by some Russians, actually. Some Russians who've deserted and joined the Stella Rossa.
This is what's going on, isn't it? This is the whirlwind being reaped, isn't it? Then a member of the Stella Rossa is captured by the Germans. He's strung up for the Germans. Their rope breaks, so a member of the GNR goes to get a thicker piece of rope. So the next fascist that's captured by the Stella Rossa is killed the same way. They do also disarm GNR men at barracks and send them home. So sometimes they don't have a taste for killing.
And I should also say that by this point, they've all split up into battalions.
Yeah.
And companies. They are not all on the Monticello Massif the whole time. I mean, it's the perfect place because you've got these two arteries going southwards either side of the mountains. You've got the main road going down the Reno Valley. You've got a main road and a railway line going down the Seta Valley. If you're German, you're going down the front, you have to go down these roads. Yeah. So they're perfectly placed. But there is a little bit of a split in July because Lupo is still resisting approaches of the CLNAI and their military wing, which is Kuma, which is the Comando Unico Militare Emilia Romagna. And Kuma has been urging Lupo to move away from the Monticello area. And Lupo refuses. There's big spat, the shots are fired, they patch things up. But, morale is really fragile, as it would be. These are kind of 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. But, by August, they're several hundred strong and they're still causing mayhem. There's more POWs, there's more Russians. There's a very charismatic Russian called Karaton. At one point, Karaton has this big firefight about 15 miles south of Monticello. They see off several German patrols and they kill the German commander. And usually at this point, they'd have backed off. But on this moment, Lupo thinks, this is a really good time to go for it. And so they envelop this huge, really quite large German formation. A large number of Germans are killed and an artillery battery is completely destroyed.
Wow.
For the most part, we're now talking about hit and run tactics, playing havocs with German lines of supply. And Lupo he's not interested in Kuma. He's not interested in the CLNAI. He's not interested in the CVL. What he's interested in is the Allies. This is his dream, that the Allies come. They embrace as comrades in arms. They're all treated as soldiers, fellow brothers in arms, and together they march on to Bologna. That's his dream, and that's how it's going to be. Increasingly, he's less interested in the GNR and those GNR barracks. He just thinks they're kind of, local small fry stuff. What he really wants to do is hit the Germans and the German lines of supply and lines of communication. So telephone lines cut, trucks attacks, roads blown, patrols attacking and sniping at lone vehicles going up the road and all this sort of stuff. And the truth is in isolation, these attacks are kind of are a nuisance, but they're being repeated all over. And between June and August 1944, Kesselring is told in an intelligence briefing that the partisans had killed in action 5,000 troops and wounded in action and captured 30,000. So that's 35,000 in total, which is probably about 4 divisions by 1944 standards.
That's quite the headache for Kesselring, for the Germans. He's on the back foot, the front's closing, heading north, getting closer and closer to Monticello, to the point where you can hear the guns at the front line in Monticello. And Lupo thinks, well, the Allies are going to be here any minute and I'm going to join them and they'll treat me as a soldier and everything's going to work out. However, the SS were now turning their attention to dealing with the Stella Rossa. They've been doing well. They've been having quite an effect, although the morale is fragile, or brittle is probably the right word for it. When it's going well, it's going well. But when it isn't, it's not brilliant.
Well, you can imagine you're Carlo Venturi. You're sleeping in your cave one night and you're 18 and you wake up in the middle of the night and you suddenly think, what the heck am I doing? My parents don't even know if I'm alive or dead.
And also, the whole thing's predicated on the Allies arriving soon. We started in May, didn't we? With people joining and the summer's coming and the weather's good. And now we're into September and you're starting to look at another autumn and the weather tailing off and the Allies still aren't here. It must have in May, June, when Rome falls. It must just feel like it's a matter of days, a week, a fortnight, if anything. But now you're into the autumn. And he calls his battalion commanders together on the 11th of September. And he's finally, the previous month in August, he's given in to the pressure from the political part of the resistance to allow political commissars from the CLNAI, the CVL, and Khmer because he wants support. He's compromised his merry band of free-roaming apolitical group, and he hates it.
Well, what he doesn't want is he doesn't want there suddenly to be a communist battalion and suddenly, because then they'll all start fighting amongst themselves. So he wants to try and keep it as apolitical as he possibly can. That's basically, and I think he's absolutely spot on about that.
No, it's a very elegant solution, isn't it?
But the big problem, he's trying to kind of create a sense of cohesion and unity, but they're getting short of arms. The Allies are so ruthless with partisans. They are in France. Either you're useful to the Allies, in which case you'll get arms drops, or you're not useful to the Allies, in which case you'll be hung out to dry.
Yeah.
That happens in France. It happens here as well, but it happens across Italy because the second front's opened and Operation Dragoon has taken place on the 15th of August. Now arms are needed to be dropped to southern French Maquis as well.
Yeah.
And they've also decided that they're going to really focus on Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia because there aren't any Allied troops in Yugoslavia. So if you help the partisans do that, they're doing the job of tying down German divisions there without getting them sent to the Allied front in Italy or the Western Front for that matter. The amount of supplies that are getting dropped to the Italian partisans is tailed off dramatically. And then on the 17th of September, Kesselring issues his final warning to the Stella Rossa. This is specifically to them. And he talks about the actions of bandits that can no longer be tolerated. He goes, "This battle without quarter for the destruction of banditry and delinquency must therefore be carried out by the entire Italian population." So what he's basically saying is you need to turn in all of these guys. And if you don't, we're going to treat you all as partisans. The partisans can only exist in the mountains with the tacit support of the locals.
And of course, that makes them very vulnerable to reprisal, doesn't it? Is the truth. It's what you're going to resort to if you're the Germans, isn't it? You're going to say, well, these people are dependent on the locals, so we're going to punish them via the locals. It's not a big leap of imagination to know that that's what's going to happen next, is it? Lupo's attitude is the Allies are on their way. We're not going to quit at the point of victory. No way.
The point of victory.
Yeah. I mean, what do the partisans and the locals, because the front's closing in, what do they know about what's going on?
Well, almost nothing. This is a point. A lot of it's just sort of guesswork and rumor mill. And, this is all part of, the late summer assault on the Gothic line, and the bombers going over attacking the Brenner Pass again and hitting those, German lines of supplies and deep in the rear and all the rest of it. It's understandable that on Monticello, they would think that the Allies are kind of almost upon them because they literally are.
Yeah.
The Stella Rossa are now pretty much all gathered up on around Monticello, and Kuma had even asked Lupo to take command of all partisans in the region to help liberate Bologna. And Lupo actually declines this. He feels it's too much responsibility, and he wants to be standing shoulder to shoulder with the Allies, not with a bunch of bedraggled partisans. And this is why he insists they all suddenly now draw in on the Monticello Massif. So the deployment of them all is much easier, but of course it's a high-risk strategy because if the Germans launch a Rastrellamento, they're all sitting ducks because they're now low of ammo. It's not like the attack on the 28th of May when they were just flush with guns and they could see them off.
Not only can they hear the guns, they're effectively in range of them. However, on the other side of the hill, 16th Waffen-SS Panzergrenadier Division have taken over this stretch of the front from the 362nd Infantry Division. There are some aggrieved and angry Nazis in town. In reserve at Rio Veggio with the 16th SS Recce Battalion is a unit that includes Hauptsturmführer Wilfried Segebrecht. And Segebrecht, he sums up how Germans feel about partisans. They know that they're really, really keenly aware of them in Italy. Their attitude is they've got this thing to deal with at the front that's really, really difficult. For us fighting troops on the Gothic line, the question of supplies was a question of life. Without regular supplies of munitions and food, and without the possibility of moving the wounded back, our positions against the Allies could not be held. The strategic effect that the Stella Rossa are having as far as Segebrecht is concerned from his point of view, and it's bad enough that they're in their rear, but now that the lines are pushing onto Monticello, they're moving through, as they retreat, through absolute copper-bottom partisan territory. And they're seeing the Germans retreat.
Well, they think it's retreat. It's just a changeover, but they're seeing these disheveled German troops. The guns are booming only a dozen miles away. Word gets out about what is going on, that suddenly it feels like the front is moving. It feels like things are happening.
If nothing else, the weight of Allied firepower is something to avoid. But what choice have these people got? That's the other thing. What choice do you have when you can hear the guns less than 10 miles away, the thunder of it? You know exactly what's coming.
You can only make the decision that you think is the best with the very, very limited amount of information that you have. So what are the German plans? Well, they're pretty ruthless, as you can imagine.
Yeah, well, they've decided that they can't have trouble in their rear. Kesselring knows about Stella Rossa. General Alfred Schlemm, who's the officer commanding the 1st Fallschirmjäger Corps, which includes 16th SS, he's like, well, we've got to do something about this. I can't try to deal with 2 problems at once. So he speaks to Gruppenführer Max Simon, who's the officer commanding of 16th SS, says you need to get some spare troops, carry out an action against the Stella Rossa. So the people he can spare are the Recce Battalion, 16th SS Recce Battalion, under Sturmbannführer Walter Raeder, who's a one-armed veteran of the Eastern Front. So I think we know what he might be like. They're already involved in anti-partisan operations. They're involved in an attack at Bardini Santo Lorenzo in August, where they captured and killed 159 civilians. So these people, they have form.
The planning of it is left to Obersturmbannführer Loos from the 16th SS Divisional Staff. And his brief is absolutely clear. Clear the mountains entirely from Grizzana Morandi to Sasse Marconi. So basically the entire Montesoli Massif. And Loos is helped by a fascist spy, a chap called Lorenzo Mingardi. So he knows that the mass of the Stella Rossa is now on and around Montesoli. The troops are going to attack in a wide encirclement. So the idea is to cast a wide net, both from the Seta Valley and the Reno Valley, and just basically go up like that and just destroy everything and then converge at the top. But the main thrust is going to be coming from Walter Raeder's Recce Battalion. Wilfried Segebrecht, who is the number 1 company commander, is fully briefed. And he goes, this brigade is known as one of the most radical and fanatical with strong communist tendencies. Hard and desperate battles which could be supported and strengthened by the resistance population are to be expected. And that's the key bit, the resident population. In other words, what they've been told is, don't discriminate between partisan and civilian. They're all in it together.
Yeah.
Kill the lot. And let me tell you a little bit about Cornelia Pacelli. She and her family were very, very typical of the folk living in that area at that time. She also knew Gianni Rossi and Lupo and Sugano and the others in the Stella Rossa. It's all kind of like super localized.
On the 28th, word reaches the Stella Rossa that Lagaro is now in Allied hands. They're coming. They're only a few miles to the south of the Grizzana Morandi. Later that afternoon, Lupo disagrees with El Vecchio. El Vecchio worries that he thinks they're sitting ducks. Lupo's being overconfident is what El Vecchio thinks. He's not suspecting at all that there is a rastrellamento coming. Amazingly, Lupo and Gianni, they both have girlfriends at Cardotto and Leone. So they go down to Cardotto late that afternoon to see their partners.
Well, Il Vecchio has been saying, you should stay up here in the top of the mountains. We've got our brigade headquartered up here. Don't go down to Cardotto, because if the Germans do come, then at least you can see and you can do something about it. And they go, no, it'll be fine. Il Vecchio says, well, go and see them, but then come back at night. And, but it's dark and it's raining and they just think, let's stay where we were. So they don't. They stay in Cardotto.
The thing is with this, Jim, is there's so much contingent in this. None of it feels fated. There's lots of different reasons for joining the partisans, lots of different reasons for refusing to. But the Germans have a clear purpose, and it's kind of strange in a way that that's been forgotten.
So the Germans start their attack at 5 a.m. They're on the start line. They've crossed the Seta. The Ost Regiment is in place south of Marzabotto, and the 16th SS Recce Battalion is over the railway line. So the plan is to move up systematically and destroy everything. And Hauptsturmführer Wilfried Segebrecht, his 1 company is attacking up towards the mountain village of San Martino and clearing farmsteads and partisans on the way. And so that means that Cardotto, where Lupo and Gianni and Leone have been overnight, is literally one of the first farmsteads they come to.
While the terrain worked for the partisans when they were trying to harass German traffic on the railway line, where they are is working completely against them, is the truth. This is a much more serious effort by the Germans than the one they faced earlier in the summer.
So there's a lone guard on the track, but the patrols that Lupo had ordered, they're nowhere to be seen. But anyway, the guard spots figures and he fires 2 shots and then killed by a volley of fire. That starts to wake everybody up. The battle has begun, basically, and everyone is now awake. And Gianni Rossi is in the main house and he opens the front door and is met with a burst of machine gun bullets that effectively slices Leonie's wife in half, so she's dead. There's a pause, and Gianni shouts out, and Colonello replies that they seem to be completely surrounded. And Gianni says, "Do what you can, and we'll try and get to the command post." And Colonello says, "But we're surrounded on all sides. You won't be able to make it." And in the farmhouse, there's pandemonium, as you can imagine. Lupo's raging around about the lack of patrols, going, well, where the hell are they? How on earth have we been caught short? But his anger is clearly directed at his own foolishness.
Yeah.
He knows that he's cocked up.
Yeah.
And Gianni says to Lupo, "Look, I think, and Leone, I think we should make a dash for it. The light is dim, it's raining, they know the mountains, the Germans don't. And frankly, they don't have really any choice."
Yeah.
So the three of them go from a door in the house to the hayloft next to it. They run for it, and Gianni is ahead of the other twos when they're spotted, and they can hear someone shout out. There's a crack of rifle fire. Gianni's hit in the elbow, but he still manages to turn around and fire back, as does Lupo and Leone, and three Germans are dropped to the ground. There's more firing from the Germans, and Gianni's hit again in the other arm, and he falls over into the mud, and bullets are whistling over his head, and Leone and Lupo collapse beside him, and Gianni goes, "I can't go on," and Lupo says says "stai tranquillo," which means in Italian means stay calm. Gianni kind of pauses a bit. He managed to get to his feet. They're running blindly. He managed to reach the trees, and suddenly the firing stops immediately after them. But he can't see Lupo or Leone, and he thinks, where the hell are they? But there's some other partisans there. There's a partisan patrol who help him up to Catermine, and where his wounds are dressed, and he's able to rest for a while. But there's still no sign of Leone or Lupo. He doesn't know where they are. By this time, the rest of the Germans are slowly kind of moving up the mountain slopes, burning, setting fire to farmsteads, and rounding up the women and children. And of course, that includes Cornelia Pacelli and her family. You can imagine how terrifying it must have all been.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, her father says, wake up, the Germans are burning houses. It's not safe here. Go take refuge in the church. And you'd think that's a safe place to go. So she goes with her mother, her younger sister, and the younger twins. They're all hurried up along the track. They get to the church at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so they do what you would do in the set of circumstances. They pray. They all pray. An hour later, there's loud knocking on the door. It's German troops shouting. And they go and talk to the priest. Cornelia watches them talk to the priest, Don Ubaldo. And she doesn't understand German, but she gets the gist. The Germans have found a cache of arms at Cadizola. And this was where the 4th Battalion of the Stella Rossa have been, but they've slipped away. Now, of course, the Germans have been told that the civilians are part of the insurgency. So she might think we're okay because we're obviously civilians, but the Germans are under pressure. They're in a hurry. They're barking orders and they're scaring people. Don Ubaldo, the priest, tries to reason with them, and then they're stopped. A German smashes in the lock of the gate of the cemetery with the butt of his rifle. Another stands guard with a submachine gun. So the 2 guards are left with the people at the cemetery, while the others go back towards the church with the priest. 20 minutes pass. And Cornelia's thinking about getting away. Cornelia says, there's only one reason to open the gate. I said to myself, this is the end. There was no reason otherwise for them to have opened the gate. I kept thinking, if I could move a few meters, I could jump and hide myself.
They hear a single shot, and that is Don Ubaldo being killed.
God.
Then the other Germans then return without the priest.
And they're shouting, raus, raus, ushering them into the cemetery.
And this cemetery is... It's walled, and inside there's a tiny little chapel. It's really small little stone chapel. It's not big at all. They were told to go in there and line up against the far end of the wall. And I guess it's sort of tennis court size, something like that.
So there's been a grenade thrown into the crowd.
This has concussed Cornelia and blown her into the centre. So this actually saves her. And as machine guns open up, she's still on the ground. So the bodies start falling on top of her, and blood is spreading all over her body. And at this point, she then faints. And when she comes to, more bodies are piled all around her, and she can hear voices, and she can hear her mother going, Cornelia, Cornelia, are you still alive? And Cornelia goes, Mama, be quiet, please. Don't talk, otherwise they'll kill you. And her mother goes, the twins are dead. The twins are dead. She's absolutely distraught. She'd been holding the twins to her. And they then wait there for a long time, several hours. And Cornelia is just listening. She just doesn't dare move an inch or barely breathe. And not until about 4 o'clock that afternoon. Bear in mind, this is happening about, 9:30 in the morning. does she feel it's safe to move? So she's been there well over 6 hours. And then she said, well, look, I'm going to try and get help. And unfortunately, the massacre at the cemetery has been repeated all over the mountains, in the villages and hamlets and farmsteads. And they are being systematically cleared. Men, women, children herded into barns and shot or burned. But meanwhile, the battle at Cadotto is also over by the evening, but a number of the partisans have managed to escape. But those who haven't, obviously, are all killed. Cornelia, meanwhile, reaches Gardaletto and sees Germans, so then goes to the family home in Cavaneziani. But it's locked, of course, as it had been when they left. So she goes to the farm a few hundred yards away where they got milk and where they'd left their pet lamb, and that they finds the lamb dead, but also the farmer and wife killed as well.
It is interesting that it's not better known, Jim. Yes, the Italian theatre's a forgotten or a neglected theatre, but this is just appalling and dramatic and tragic and brutal as anything anywhere, right?
And up on Montesoli, which from Montesoli you can look down on the cemetery.
Yeah.
So Virginio, Cornelia's father, has been wandering through the scrub, deranged with grief. Yeah. He'd seen it all. Yeah. And he tried to persuade the partisans to do something because they'd seen them being marched down the road from the church. He says, this is what's going to happen. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. The partisans go, it's impossible. We just can't. We'll all get killed. So he sees the massacre and he sees that mountain community, which he's known all his life, being destroyed.
Yeah.
And at midnight, he scrambles down and goes to the cemetery. But by this point, it's locked again. The Germans have locked the gate. And he thinks they're all dead. All he can just see in the moonlight are these bodies. And in fact, actually, Giuseppina is alive and is tending his wife at that point, who is now, by this point, slipping in and out of consciousness. So Virginio thinks they're all dead and slips back into the night. He's absolutely losing his mind, and this terrible day for this centuries-old community. It's just horrendous. But the next day, Saturday the 30th of September, it's not over. Angelina Pizzelli is lying dying. She tells her daughter, Giuseppina, that she dreamed her husband had been there. By this point, she's increasingly fretful during her conscious moments and calling out for Cornelia. And Giuseppina goes, no, Papa wasn't here. He wasn't here, but he had been. And it's not clear whether it was just a dream. But Cornelia is alive. She'd wandered aimlessly the previous afternoon, and then waded across the Seta. And as she's wading across, shots ring out and hit the water. But she calls out and cries for help. And one of her father's colleagues appears and hurries her into a hut in the woods. Says, God, just keep out of the way. Shut up, But the following morning, they're back. They're back clearing it out, combing through the mountain, setting fire to remaining houses. Gianni Rossi is still alive, actually, but there's still no sign of Lupo. The troops have also returned to Cerpiano, so Francesco Perini is still stuck in the woods, and he's still got his eyes on the chapel. And then more German troops arrive, and the door of the chapel is opened, and all of them are gunned down. So he sees them just open up with a machine gun at the hip, and boom, that's it. And then the men go to the schoolhouse and start playing the piano, and he's just sat in this shrub, clutching his head, having witnessed 9 members of his family being killed. And then he hears these tones of the piano sort of trilling out over the air. I mean, can you imagine it? And it's not until Tuesday, the 3rd of October, that Cornelia is finally allowed to leave the hut. She finds her sister and they go to a refuge in San Mamante, which is a farmstead a few miles to the north. And a week later, their father finds them. And Cornelia says, when he saw us, he laughed and cried of pain and of happiness, but he seemed a different person. He told them that he was going to try and find some food and left them. But no sooner did he did that, he was picked up by the German troops and press gang into the organisation top. And a few months later, he died too. 772 people are killed over the 3 days on Montesoli, which trumps Ladici and Oridor. Yeah. 191 killed in the cemetery at Cassalia, all civilians. 216 partisans killed, and the Stella Rossa was finished. But Gianni manages to sneak through to the Allied lines and packed off to hospital. And later, he joins Italian forces attached to the Allies and does help liberate Bologna, just as Lupo had imagined. But of Lupo, there is absolutely no sign at all.
It's a great success for the Germans, isn't it? They've knocked out the Stella Rossa, so they haven't got that problem in their rear as they prepare to defend Bologna.
Nope, it's gone.
When you've people so brutalised by the German army, the Wehrmacht and the SS, We're 5 years into their Europe-wide self-brutalization as they put Europe to the sword and scorched earth everywhere. And it is this thing. The Eastern Front is the norm. The Western Front is the exception. And so when methods from the East visit the West, they feel extra shocking, don't they?
Because this is Italy, and Italy is the place of the Renaissance, and all that amazing art and Botticelli and Michelangelo and sophistication and this beautiful food and amazing wine.
The Germans are the most cultured people in Europe as well. That's the thing that's always the question mark about how does that happen in supposedly the most advanced and clever country in Europe. This I've found absolutely harrowing, personally harrowing. It's unimaginable.
The bullet holes are still there. I should also say that Cassalia, the church, is a complete ruin. I mean, all those villages, Cepiano, Cassalia, San Martino, ruined. It's a haunting place. And more so because it's so beautiful. This stuff doesn't leave you. It is absolutely there like it was yesterday in a way that other interviews have come and gone. This is a very personal story to me.
Well, thanks for sharing it with all of us, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks, James, for taking us through that extraordinary and awful story. We'll see you again very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.